Welcome to Medieval India, Episode 30, Disaster at Panipat. Shahu died on 15 December 1749, aged 67, after a reign of over 41 years. The Peshwa at once occupied Satara with his troops, arrested the Pratinidhi and other rivals, and called a meeting of the council, in which he produced a will which, he asserted, gave him the right to administer the kingdom on behalf of Ramraja and his heirs. Sakwabai was offered the alternative of coming in on the Peshwa's side or of immolating herself. She chose the latter option and went to her doom with the traditional courage of the Maratha lady. The place of her self-immolation is still regarded as holy ground. The young king was brought in triumph to Satara and solemnly crowned by the Peshwa amid great public rejoicing on 4 January 1750. The new king was a feeble-minded youth and an easy tool in the hands of his astute minister. Tarabai, who had hoped to control him as she had done his father, retired to Singar, ostensibly to be near her husband's ashes, but in reality to start intriguing with the Pant Sachiv, who was the commander of the fort. Balaji, who was attending some wedding ceremonies in Pune, thereupon summoned Tarabai and the Pansa chief into his presence. Tarabai was treated with respect, but the Pansa chief was thrown into prison. Ramraja was then invited to leave Satara, where he was in charge of Rakochi Bonsle, and come to Pune. This marks the culminating point of the Peshwa's coup d'etat. Never before had the Chhatrapati been brought from his capital by his minister. From this point on, writes Grandove, Pune may be considered the capital of the Peshwas. Under Balaji's direction, Ramraja drew up a document known as the Sangola Agreement, by which all the chief officers in the state were handed over to the Peshwa's adherents. When the monsoon of 1750 was drawing to a close, and the Dasra celebration season announced, the beginning of the campaigning season too, the Peshwa thought himself sufficiently secure to set out for Hyderabad. The old Nizam had died on 1 June 1748 at Berhampur, aged 79, and a war of succession had broken out among his sons. The Peshwa, in return for important concessions, had agreed to support the elder Ghaziuddin against Salabat Jang. His real aim, however, was no less than the annexation of Hyderabad to the Maratha Empire. But he had reckoned without Tarabai. Scarcely had he turned his back, then the indefatigable old queen, upon whom years seemed only to confer fresh energy, organized a far-reaching conspiracy to throw off forever the yoke of the hated Brahman. She found no lack of support among the Maratha chiefs, who were smarting under the Sangola achievement. Her first step, however, was to get into her power the miserable puppet who now sat on the throne of the great Shivaji. Having seized the fort of Satara, she invited Ramaraja to a banquet and cast him into prison. On 24 November 1750, she then prevailed upon another Maratha lady, Umabai, the widow of Kandarao Dabade, to call in her late husband's old lieutenant, the Kaikwar, from Gujarat. Damaji Kaikwar was nothing loath to do so. He advanced upon Satara with 15,000 men in order to link up with the forces of Tarabai. But the peshwa was too quick for the two of them. Hearing of what had transpired while near Raichur, by forced marches in which he covered 400 miles in 13 days, he descended upon Damaji Kaikwar, who was hotly exchanged by Nana Purandare and others. The Kaikwar fell back before his new opponent and retreated into a cul-de-sac in the Krishna Valley. The Gujarat troops, unused to jungle fighting, became disorganized, and Damaji had no option but to negotiate. The Peshwa pressed him to surrender half of Gujarat and pay an indemnity of 2.5 million rupees. Finding him obdurate, he suddenly, in spite of the truce, attacked and captured Damaji together with his son and Umabai Dabade and sent them as prisoners to Pune. So incensed was Damaji at this piece of treachery that ever after he refused to salute the Peshwa except with his left hand. Balaji's terms of ransom and the yearly tribute of 500,000 rupees were severe, and for a long time Damaji resisted them. After 6 months of rigorous confinement, however, he capitulated, and in the cold weather of 1753 he returned homewards, accompanied by Balaji Rao and a considerable force, with the object of reinstating himself as sole ruler of Gujarat and expelling the remaining Mughal viceroy. After a desperate struggle, Ahmedabad was captured and the last remains of Mughal rule in Gujarat were obliterated, save the city of Surat. Tarabai still held out defiantly in Satara fort and refused to come to terms until the Peshwa guaranteed her liberty under the most solemn oaths. The unfortunate Ramaraja remained in custody, and Tarabai now shamelessly declared that he was an impostor and the son of the Kundali, the wandering minstrel, which we have met in the previous episode. Imprisonment told on his reason, and he died in obscurity in 1777. Shortly before his death, Ramaraja adopted a son who received the name of Shahu the Younger and who reigned till 1810. But after the death of Shahu in 1749, the Maratha kings were mere fainéants, though the Peshwas, always strict constitutionalists, professed to the last to act as their viceroys and sent all documents for their signature to their state prison in Satara fortress. For this change in government, Tarabai and the Maratha nobles, rather than the peshwa, were to blame. They had no fixed policy and little thought except for personal aggrandizement. Shahu had deliberately allowed the executive power to lapse into the hands of his capable and patriotic minister and preferred to leave the young heir to the throne under the tutelage of the Peshwa rather than expose the country to the risk of civil war. The usurpation of the Peshwas neither attracted observation nor excited surprise. Indeed, the transition was easy, natural and progressive. Its greatest disadvantage was that it aggravated the centrifugal tendencies in the Maratha state, and especially the enmity between Brahman and Maratha, which was at least kept in check while a member of the House of Bhonsle ruled. And after the Peshwa's prestige was shaken by the defeat at Panipat, the disintegration of the state became ever more evident. Balaji, having crossed his rivals, was now once more at liberty to turn his attention to foreign affairs. In the cold weather of 1751, the war with Hyderabad was renewed. But the French commander in India, Duplessis, had meanwhile lent a formidable French fighting force under the Marquis de Bussy to the Nizam, and his trained infantry outmaneuvered the old-style forces of the Peshwa and inflicted more than one defeat upon him. At one time, Bussy's force penetrated to within 16 miles of Poona, but the troops of the Nizam mutinied for want of pay and the campaign collapsed with the poisoning in 1752 of Ghazi ud-Din, the Peshwa's candidate for the Nizam's throne. In 1754, Balaji organized the Mulkiri or revenue seizing expedition on a stupendous scale to collect the arrears of tribute from the Karnataka, exterminate the last remnants of Mughal rule, plunder Mysore and replenish the Peshwa's exhausted coffers. From every village through which the Marathas passed, money was extorted and treasure chests rifled, till the countryside looked as though it had been devastated by a swarm of locusts. On their return, laden with booty, the Marathas combined with the Nizam's forces in attacking the Nawab of Savanur, who had put himself at the head of a confederacy of Afghan nawabs and southern Maratha chiefs who refused to acknowledge the Peshwa. The tremendous effect of Muzaffar Khan's artillery, who had been trained by Bussy at the bombardment of Savanur fortress, greatly impressed his Maratha allies. In 1758, Bussy was recalled by the new French commander Lally from the Nizam service, and a quarrel broke out between Nizam Ali, the brother of Salabadjan, and the Peshwa. Balaji, knowing that without their famous French commander Bussy, the Hyderabad troops would be easy to deal with, determined to attack them. He first scored two bloodless triumphs. Ahmadnagar, the Nizam's great fortress and place of arms in the Deccan, was taken without a blow. The commander, Kafi Jang, having been bribed to open the gates to the Marathas. This deprived the Hyderabad army of its advanced base. Secondly, Ibrahim Khan Kardi, the commander of the Nizam's artillery, a soldier of fortune who had been trained by Bussy himself, was induced to enter the Peshwa's service. The two brothers, Salabat Jang and Nizam Ali, were in no condition to fight. Their troops were in arrears and mutinous, but they could not afford to neglect the challenge when they saw the ancient stronghold of the Nizam Shahi kings, Ahmadnagar, which had cost the Mughals so much blood and treasure, to be captured, filched away in this treacherous manner. The Peshwa put the Maratha army, 40,000 strong, under the command of his cousin, Balaji Rao, son of Chimnachi Apte. With it marched Ibrahim Khan Gardi with his 5,000 regular sepoys trained in the European manner and his famous French artillery. Battle was joined on 3 February 1760 at Udgir, 200 miles east of Pune. The Mughals fought bravely, but their crowded ranks were decimated by the Gardi's artillery, and a smashing cavalry charge decided the action. The Mughal army fell back in disorder upon the fortress of Awadh, where, after a 4-day siege, the two brothers sued for peace. Seldom had the Marathas won a more spectacular victory, and Balaji Rao insisted on terms which were calculated to cripple the state of Hyderabad forever. Territory around Bijapur, Bidar and Aurangabad, to the extent of an annual income of 6 million rupees, together with the key fortresses of Daulatabad, Asirkar, Bijapur, Ahmadnagar and Burhanpur, were to be surrendered. The Marathas were now a very different people from the sturdy hillmen who had fought and conquered under the great Shivaji. They were like our old Britons, as John Fryer had described them in the 17th century, half naked and as fierce. Contact with the Mughals, however, had introduced into the Deccan a love of refinement and culture that was before unknown. The nobles and their wives now went about arrayed in silk and cloth of gold. Contemporary correspondence contains constant applications from writers in the Deccan to their friends in Hindustan to procure for them old Sanskrit manuscripts, pictures and carvings, other articles of luxury, and dancing girls or musicians. The fine examples of Mughal and Rajput painting to be found today in places like Satara probably found their way to the Deccan at this time. The Shamvarwade in Pune, the Peshwa's official residence, was 6 stories high and contained a series of sumptuous halls decorated with mirrors and carved ivory and marble courtyards, where innumerable fountains placed incessantly. In the Peshwa's court, the elaborate etiquette of the Mughal nobility was followed. But all this imported luxury had a demoralizing effect upon the hardy and simple character of the Maratha soldiers. Balaji Rao, in the intervals between his campaigns, did a great deal to improve the administration of the Maratha state. Regularly appointed officers were placed in charge of several districts, and the territory round Satara, being the best protected and most productive, was entrusted to the Peshwa's favorites. They were in absolute charge of the administration, but were expected to furnish proper accounts. This, however, was very irregularly done, as the holders of these offices, being usually absent on campaign or in attendance at the Peshwa's court in Pune, left the work in the hands of dishonest and corrupt officials. Balaji Rao placed the civil administration in the hands of his great minister, Ramchandra Senvi, and after his death, Sadashiv Rao. The latter appointed as the revenue collector a very able man by the name of Baloba Banduva Kum, who introduced sweeping reforms and forced the collectors to produce their accounts. At the same time, the administration of justice was reformed. A strong police force was organized in Pune city, and a famous lawyer, Bal Kishan Kajkil, was appointed Chief Justice. The panchayats, or courts of arbitration, were improved, and altogether the administration was established upon a sound basis. Abuses in revenue collection were checked, and the villagers were encouraged to resist the exactions of every petty commander of horse who tried to levy blackmail on them. Each village, as always, was a tiny republic administered by the headman, assisted by the accountant and other village officers. Over the headman was the sub-collector, and over him the collector, who had armed irregulars to assist in keeping order. Balaji Rao, or Nana Sahib as he was familiarly called, had the handsome appearance and gracious manners, but not the lofty character of his father and grandfather. His conduct towards Sakwat Bai and Damachi Kaikwar has often been stigmatized as unbecoming, and later in life he became indolent and slow. But the Maratha peasantry, remembering the all-round improvements which he had wrought in local government, have ever since blessed the days of Nana Sahib Peshwa. Meanwhile, stirring events were happening in Hindustan. Nadir Shah died in 1747. Ahmad Shah Abdali, the founder of Afghanistan, continued his policy of raiding the declining empire, which he invaded in 1748 and 1749. In 1751, Safdar the nawab of Awadh, with the sanction of the young emperor Ahmad Shah, and heedless of the danger of drawing the Marathas into disputes in the very heart of the empire, called in Malhar Rao Holkar from Malwa, Jayapashindia from Narnaul, and Suraj Mal the Jat to help him against the Bankash Afghans who had invaded Awadh and had plundered Allahabad and Lucknow. The Marathas drove the Afghans into the hills with severe losses to them and occupied Rohila Afghans in 1751. They sacked the whole country, not allowing a single man to escape, and every article they carried away as booty, as the Rohila Chronicle writes. For their help, they were given half the Bangash territory in the Doab, which they held precariously until the Panipat disaster, and which was to be the first territorial acquisition of the Marathas beyond the Jamuna. In 1752, Ahmad Shah Abdali invaded the Punjab for the third time. There was panic in Delhi, and the invader was brought off with promises of the cession of the Punjab and Bhutan. Now a new figure appeared upon the scene in the person of Ghazi Uddin the Younger, who at the time of his father's murder in 1752 was in Delhi, and with the help of Safdar became paymaster general of the empire. Almost immediately he turned against his Mughal patron and called in the Marathas on the Raghunath Rao and Malhar Rao Holkar, who were just then engaged in exacting money for the Jats. With the help of Holkar, Ahmad Shah was deposed and blinded, and Alamkir II was installed as emperor. Anarchy prevailed in the unlucky capital Delhi, and the rival factions fought daily in the streets. The Marathas bled the empire wide with their insatiable demands, and this led to a mutiny among the imperial soldiers who were months in arrear and starving. They then retired to Rajasthan, where they had for some time been engaged in taking part in dynastic disputes and collecting tribute. Here, Jayapal Scindia was murdered in July 1755. In October 1756, the Abdali once more invaded the Punjab. In January of the following year, he entered Delhi and plundered it, and 2 months later he sacked the holy city of Madura. He returned with booty reckoned at 12 million rupees, leaving Najib Khan as his agent in Delhi and his son Timur Shah as Viceroy of Lahore. As soon as Ahmad Shah's back was turned, Ghazi ud-Din once more called in the Marathas, and in February 1758 a Maratha force under Raghunath Rao invaded the Punjab, drove out Timur Shah and occupied Lahore in April 1758. Maratha power was now at its zenith. Their frontiers, says Elphinstone about it, quote, extended on the north to the Indus and the Himalaya, and to the south nearly to the extremity of the Indian peninsula. All the territory which was not their own paid tribute. The whole of this great power was wielded by one hand, and all pretensions of every description were concentrated on the peshwa. End quote. News of these successes were received with wild elation in the Pune court, where it was fondly believed that the Bakwa Janda, the standard of the Maratha state, was now flying over the walls of Attock in the foothills of the Himalaya. As a matter of fact, the wisdom of Raghunath Rao's ambitious policy was open to grave doubt. It did not bring in even an anna for the Peshwa's coffers, and the Marathas were not in a position to hold a country where both Sikhs and Muslims looked on them as intruders. Lastly, by provoking the retaliation of Abdali, it led to the downfall of the Maratha power in Hindustan. In 1758, the main Maratha army retired from the north, leaving a garrison at Lahore in charge of Balaji Rao. Meanwhile, the Abdali, who was furious at the expulsion of his son, had resolved to bring to a decisive issue the quarrel with the Hindu power, which had crossed his track of conquest, ill-treated his allies, and made war on true believers, as Elphinstone says. He had settled his internal dissensions in Afghanistan, and was now preparing a new invasion. He crossed the Indus on August 1759, and Balaji was forced to evacuate Lahore and fall back on Delhi. Having been joined by the Rohila chiefs, Ahmad Shah advanced on the capital, driving the Marathas before him. His movements were hastened by the news of the cruel murder of the emperor by Ghazi ud-Din on 29 November. On 9 January 1760, at the Barari Ghat, 10 miles north of Delhi, Ahmad Shah defeated and slew Balaji Rao. His nephew Yangochi fled with the remnants of his army to Rajasthan, where he managed to effect a junction with Malharao Holkar. Worse, however, was to follow. On 4 March, Ahmad Shah's general, Jahan Khan, after a forced march, surprised and completely routed Malharao near Sikandarabad. In one short campaign, the power of the Marathas in Hindustan was completely shattered. The news of the defeat and death of Dattaji reached the Peshwa on 15 February, just while the Marathas in the Deccan were jubilantly celebrating their victory at Udgir. It was at once decided that a force must be dispatched under a member of the Peshwa's family to restore Maratha influence in Hindustan. Raghunath Rao applied for the command, and with his experience of fighting in northern India, undoubtedly the choice should have fallen upon him. But Raghunath Rao had incurred very heavy expenditures during his last campaign, which had brought no revenue to the exchequer, and for this reason he was under a cloud. Little love was lost between the two cousins, and on the strength of this, Sadashiv Rao, the hero of Udgir, claimed the command. The Peshwa, now too indolent to take the field himself, unwisely agreed, but with him, according to the ancient customs of the Marathas, he sent his young heir, Vishwas Rao, a gallant and handsome lad of 19 years, as nominal commander and the Peshwa's representative. The army, which set out from Padur in the Deccan on 10 March 1760, was the most magnificent that the Marathas had ever sent forth to battle. There were 20,000 of the famous Maratha horse, including the household cavalry, commanded by chieftains of note who had fought from one end of India to the other: Balwant Rao Mehendale, Shamshir Bahadur, Balaji Rao's son by the notorious Mastani, Naro Shankar, Vital Shivdev Vinchurkar, Trimkar Sadashiv Purandare, Antachi Mankeshwar, and a host of others. With them went Ibrahim Khan Kardi's corps of 9,000 sepoys trained under Bussy on the French model, with 40 pieces of artillery which had done so well at Udgir. But the experienced observer would have noted signs about this imposing array well calculated to make him uneasy. Shivaji's successes had been due to the fact that his men moved without transport, subsisting on a noseback of grain carried on the saddle and on food taken from the surrounding country. And that great commander had made it an offence punishable with death to bring a woman into the camp. But the Bhao Sahib, Sadashiv Rao, moved with a vast amount of equipage and thousands of camp followers. Behind followed vast numbers of elephants, loaded with lofty silken tents. The wives of the principal nobles accompanied their husbands with numerous retinues, and the officers were resplendent in cloth of gold. Lastly, the Marathas were forsaking their traditional tactics for new methods, based on European models that were as yet imperfectly assimilated. But no thought of disaster troubled the mighty but unwielding host as it slowly made its way through Aurangabad, Berhampur and Gwalior to the banks of the Chambal, which was reached on 4 June. As it moved northwards, reinforcements poured in. Malhar Rao Holkar, Jangotsi Scindia, Damaji Kaikwar, Jaswant Rao Powar, with other Maratha chiefs, and innumerable bands of vagabonds, Pindaris, flocked to the royal standards, till the total exceeded 300,000 men, of whom about 1/4 were fighting men, with 200 cannons. This was no longer an army, it was a crusade, united to drive the Afghan invaders from the sacred soil of Bharatvarta. But now rifts began to appear. The Rajputs, offended at the high-handed conduct of Scindia and Holkar, held aloof. At the Chambal, Suraj-Mal, the Jat chief of Bharatpur, whom we shall encounter again in the last episode, rode in with his force and a council of war was held. Suraj Mal, a veteran fighter, earnestly advised the Bhao Sahib to park his luggage and artillery at Bharatpur and then to start guerrilla operations in the traditional Maratha fashion against the Abdalis' flank and rear. By this means, he said, and by avoiding a pitched battle, they would compel the Abdali very quickly to retreat. Holkar and Scindia heartily concurred in this view. But the Bhao Sahib contemptuously rejected the sage advice of these experienced warriors. He called it the chatter of goatherds and zamindars. The taunt deeply wounded the pride of the Maratha generals, and the old jealousy of the rule of the Chitpavan Brahman broke out afresh. If this Brahman wins, the commander said, he will send his couriers to collect the revenues of Hindustan, and we shall have to wash his loincloths. It is better that he should meet with a defeat, or else what consideration shall we be allowed? End quote. The Marathas were outside Delhi by the end of July, and the fortress was captured without much difficulty on 2 August. Here too the Bhao Sahib's conduct gave great offence. In order to pay his troops, he stripped off the silver from the ceiling of the great hall of audience in the Red Fortress and plundered tombs and shrines which Persians and Afghans alike had respected. A rumor was even spread that he intended to place Vishwas Rao on the Mughal throne. Dismayed at this behavior, Suraj Mal and his Jats quickly decamped. The loss of these seasoned troops was a serious loss, but the Bhao Sahib affected to make fun of it, saying that nothing more could be expected of mere landholders. The Maratha host spent the rainy season encamped in and around Delhi, while the Abdali army was in quarters at Anupsar in the Bulandshahr district, both parties being busily engaged in intrigues, through their agents, for the support of Suraj Uddaula, the Nawab Vizier of Awadh, who had succeeded his uncle Safdar Jung in 1754, and who had at first remained neutral in this conflict. Proposals were also made by the Bhao Sahib that the Abdali should be given large territories north of the Sutlej on condition that he withdrew. But they fell through, chiefly on account of the opposition of Najib Khan, the Rohila, who had good reasons to hate the Marathas for ravaging Rohilkhand, his kingdom, and wanted them retire for good, and all behind the line of the Chambal. Shuja Uddaula finally reluctantly decided to join his co-religionists. The rains were now over. The Dasra festival was at hand, and both sides prepared to take the field. The Bhao Sahib moved upstreams, leaving Naro Shankar with about 7,000 Maratha troops to garrison Delhi. The Abdali was on the other side of the river. His army was slightly superior in numbers to that of his opponents, and the Duranis were men of great bodily strength and of great size, mounted on swift Turkish horses. About 78 miles north of Delhi lay the fortified post of Kunjpura, well stocked with money and provisions, of which the Marathas were in sore need, and commanding an important fort over the Jamuna. It was held by Nijabad Khan with 10,000 picked Rohila troops, and on 17 October the Bhao Sahib determined to attack it. It was taken by storm after a fierce bombardment by Ibrahim Khan's heavy guns, and the garrison was put to the sword on the pretext that Nijabad Khan had been responsible for the death of Dadaji Scindia at Badaunkhat. The Jamuna was now in full flood and impassable, and Ahmad Shah was forced to look on helplessly while his troops were being cut to pieces. The bad discipline and the notorious love of plunder of the Marathas now proved their undoing. While they were engaged in ransacking Kunspura for treasure and celebrating the Dasra feast, they failed to keep the enemy on the other bank under observation. Ahmad Shah cleverly slipped away and marched downstream. With the help of Shuja-ud-Dawla, he found a fort at Bagpat, about 25 miles north of Delhi, and in spite of the flood, in 2 days he pushed his whole army across at all costs, losing large number of men in the process. By this masterly stroke he had placed himself between his opponents and their base. This occurred on 25 October. The Marathas came up soon after and were repulsed with loss. Had they arrived a little while earlier, they would have had the Afghans at their mercy when they were crossing the river. But now that it was too late, the Marathas attacked. They were driven off with heavy losses, however, and fell back fighting on the little town of Panipat, about 60 miles north of Delhi. Holkar once more begged the Bhao Sahib to resume the old guerrilla tactics of the Marathas, but Ibrahim Khan Kardi threatened to turn his guns upon his own side if they deserted him. The Bhao Sahib therefore threw himself into Panipat, where he proceeded to dig himself in the approved European fashion, throwing up a broad rampart with a ditch in front of it and mounting his cannons at regular intervals. He hoped to provoke the Durrani to attack him by means of raids upon his lines of communication. But the Afghan artillery was inferior to that of the Marathas, and Ahmad Shah was too old and too experienced a soldier to be drawn into such a conflict except on his own terms. He therefore proceeded to entrench himself also in a fortified camp with an abbati of felled trees, about 8 miles away between the enemy and the Jamuna. The diarist Qazi Raj gives the numbers as follows: Afghans 41,800 cavalry, 38,000 infantry, total 79,800 men. Marathas 55,000 cavalry, 15,000 infantry, 15,000 pindaris, total 85,000 men. By entrenching themselves in their fortified camp, the Marathas thus lost the initiative, sacrificing also their mobility, which was their most valuable asset. But the Bhao Sahib made a still graver blunder. He had taken into the field his own wife and the wives of his officers instead of leaving them behind at Delhi. The vast crowd of retainers and camp followers was bound to eat up the provisions of Panipat in a short time. Meanwhile, negotiations were proceeding behind the scenes. Shuja-ud-Dawla was still inclined towards peace, but Najib Khan, the sworn enemy of the Marathas, again dissuaded Ahmad Shah. The Marathas, Najib Khan said, are the thorn of Hindustan. If they were out of the way, this empire might be your majesty's whenever you should please. The Bhao Sahib would not have been averse from an arrangement by which he should fall back behind the Chambal, leaving northern India in the hands of the Abdali. But such an idea met with strong opposition in Pune from Balaji Rao, who was not unnaturally reluctant to see the fruits of his conquest abandoned without a fight. The space between the two lines was now the scene of almost daily skirmishes. Horsemen rode out, challenging their foes to single combat, and a number of fierce actions developed from chance encounters. Raids by the Gardi infantry on 19 November and by Scindia on the 22nd were repulsed with losses after some initial successes, and on 7 December a Rohila attack was defeated in a spirited manner by Balaji Rao Mehendale, who drove off the Afghans with great slaughter, but was unfortunately killed in the hour of victory when his men fled. The Afghans pursued them and nearly stormed the Maratha camp, which was only saved by the approach of night. The death of Mehendale, his brother-in-law and most trusted counselor, was a serious loss to the Bhao Sahib. But about the same time he managed to get into touch with Govind Pant, the peshwa's collector in Bundelkhand, and the nawab. Govind Pant advanced rapidly with a swarm of light horsemen and, skirmishing in the traditional Maratha manner, began to cut off the enemy's supplies and harass his foraging parties. The tables were now turned. The Afghan camp was now in a state of siege, and there was a constant shortage of food. Many of the Afghan generals became seriously alarmed and urged the Abdali either to attack the Marathas or to break camp and retreat. But here Ahmad Shah showed himself to be a great captain. "This," he answered, "is a matter of war with which you are not acquainted. Military operations must not be rapidly precipitated. You shall see how I will manage this affair and bring it to a successful conclusion." End quote. He then proceeded to tighten the blockade. He established an advanced post of 5,000 men halfway between the lines, and there he pitched a little red tent, which he made his headquarters from sunrise to nightfall, riding 50 or 60 miles a day to visit his outposts. After dark, the advanced post was pushed up to the very walls of the enemy's camp and remained under arms all night while other bodies went the rounds. Ahmad Shah's orders were obeyed like destiny, says Kaziraj. No man dared to hesitate or delay one moment in executing them. The effect of this pressure soon began to tell. On 17 December, a body of horse under Attock, riding 50 miles in a day, surprised Govind Pant and his raiders and cut them to pieces. A few nights later, some 20,000 camp followers, who had left the Maratha camp to go foraging, were caught by the advanced post and all slaughtered. And to crown everything, on 6 January, a convoy bringing cash from Delhi to pay the troops, together with its escort, was similarly cut up. The state of things in the Maratha camp had now become indescribable. Grief and terror prevailed. Hundreds died every day of famine and an epidemic, the result of starvation and absence of sanitation, broke out in the vast host cooped up in this narrow area. "We were surrounded," says Nana Fatnavis in his autobiography, "and the enemy shots fell thickly among our tents daily. There we remained in a state of siege for 2 months, during which most of the cattle of the army died, and the stench in the camp was dreadful." End quote. Attempts to open negotiations with the enemy were once more foiled by the implacable hatred of Najib Khan. On 13 January, the Maratha chiefs approached their leader, saying, "It is now 2 days since we have anything to eat. Do not let us perish in this misery. Let us make one spirited effort against the enemy, and whatever is our destiny will happen. Holkar and Scindia urged once more that the cavalry should abandon the camp, leave the infantry and non-combatants to their fate, and slash its way through to Delhi. Ibrahim Khan Gardi not unnaturally refused to be so sacrificed, and the Bhao Sahib declined to abandon the women to the tender mercies of the Afghans. It was determined to deliver a general assault on the enemy's lines the following day. Whatever were the Bhao's feelings, he was too brave a man to show them, and at the close of the council, he distributed pan and supari to his officers with all the dignified ceremony of the darbar. Shortly before dawn, Shuja-ud-Dawla received a last despairing letter from the Bhao Sahib. "The cup is now full to the brim," he wrote, "and cannot hold another drop. If anything can be done, do it, or else inform me plainly at once. Hereafter there will be no time for writing or speaking." End quote. It was plain from this message that the Marathas were going to sally out. The nawab of Awadh at once told his men to fall into line and galloped off to warn Ahmad Shah Abdali. Ahmad Shah, who was sleeping, was aroused, and was soon up and seated on his charger outside the little red tent. He calmly smoked his hookah, or water pipe, and listened to the commotion in the enemy's camp. It was as yet uncertain whether the Marathas were preparing to attack or preparing to slip away. But at length the long lines of troops were seen deploying in the dim light. "Your servant's news is very true," said Ahmad Shah, and at once he issued the necessary instructions to his officers. The Marathas advanced slowly, the ends of their turbans loose and their faces anointed with saffron, a sign that they had come out to conquer or to die on the battlefield. On the left of the line was Ibrahim Khan with his regular battalions, with Damaji Kaikwar on his immediate right. On the right flank were Malharao Holkar and Jangochi Scindia. The center was composed of the household cavalry. The Bhao himself, seated beside Balaji Rao on a magnificent war elephant, took station beneath a black mango tree, and over him floated the famous Bhagwan Jhanda, the national standard of the Marathas. 3 Jari Fatkas, or crayon ensigns of the peshva, were also in the field. The Afghan center was commanded by the chief minister, Shah Wali Khan, with the pick of the Durrani troops on their great Turki mounts. On the left flank were Shah Pasand Khan and Najib-ud-Dawla, the latter facing his old enemies Scindia and Holkar. Between these and the center was Shuja-ud-Dawla with the Awadh troops. On the right flank were Barkadur Khan and Amir Beg with Rohila and Mughal contingents. The two lines advanced obliquely on a front of about 7 miles. The Maratha left under Ibrahim Khan, making contact first. The battle began with a fierce discharge of artillery and rockets all along the line, but the Maratha gunners, deceived probably by the light, fired high, and the shots flew harmlessly overhead. Thus the weapon on which the Bhao Sahib chiefly relied failed him at this critical moment. Ibrahim Khan Gardi, who had promised Balaji Rao that on this day he would justify the trust placed in him, thereupon ordered the guns to cease fighting and closed in on his opponents with the bayonet. After a fierce struggle, during which their commander was wounded, the regular sepoys pressed back the Rohilas. This exposed the Afghan centre under the chief minister, and at once the Bhao Sahib, seeing this opportunity, charged into the gap with the whole of the household cavalry at full gallop. The impact was incredibly violent. The Afghans were surprised and met their enemy at the trot, and the Marathas broke through 3 lines of their opponents. It was now impossible to see anything for the clouds of dust, and nothing could be heard but the opposing cries, Har Har, Mahadev, and Deen Deen, as the troopers, locked in a death grip, stabbed and struck with lances and battle axes, and even with daggers. The Shah Wali Khan, who commanded the centre, dismounted, and, in full armour, in a paroxysm of rage, was trying to rally his men in vain. Our country is far off, my friends, he was crying. Whither do you fly? But none heeded his orders or his exhortations. It now looked as if the battle was turning against the Afghans. Their right flank was turned and their centre was broken. Only on their left were they holding their own. Here, Najib ud-Dawla faced his old enemy, Jangotchi Sindhya. Anticipating modern methods, he advanced by short rushes, his men halting to dig themselves in, and the sappers throwing up field breastworks, while the Maratha formations were broken up by salvos of rockets. From dawn to midday, the engagement raged with the utmost fury, and at any moment the line might give way. But the Abdali knew that the commander who throws in his reserves the last wins. That psychological moment had now come. He brought up his fresh reserves, and at the same time sent his military police to wipe up, on pain of death, the stragglers who were dribbling away to the rear, and to call up the troops left to guard the camp. He then posted 4,000 men to cover his right, sent 10,000 to Shah Wali Khan, with orders for him to charge with the sword in close order at full gallop, and issued directions to Pasand Khan and Najib ud-Dawla to take the Maratha centre in the flank as soon as he saw the minister's troops on the move. Meanwhile, the mounted infantry galloped along the enemy lines, firing from their saddles into the close ranks of the enemy. That simultaneous counterattack was launched all along the line early in the afternoon. It was excellently timed, and its effect upon the exhausted Marathas was terrible. Men and horses had been starving for weeks, and had had no food at all since dawn. Still, however, they contested the ground inch by inch. A furious engagement ensued, said the author of the Siyar al-Mutahirin, and for full 2 hours there arose such a cloud of dust that none of the combatants could distinguish the earth from the heavens. From midday to 4 o'clock nothing could be heard or seen but the furious slaughter which was going on at an incredible rate. End quote. To the fire of the mounted infantry was added that of the camel guns, Shukar-Mahal, which caused many casualties. About 2:15, Balaji Rao was wounded and had to be taken to his elephant, but the Bhao still fought on at the head of his men for an hour longer. Then, with dramatic suddenness, resistance collapsed. All at once, the diary says, as if by enchantment, the whole Maratha army turned their backs and fled at full speed, leaving the field of battle covered with heaps of dead. In the dramatic words of an eyewitness, the Hindu host melted away like camphor. The victors pursued them to their camp, giving no quarters, and the ditch was soon choked with bodies. The field of battle, the chronicle says, looked like a tract sown with tulips, and as far as the sight could extend, nothing could be discovered but bodies stretched at the foot of bodies, as if they had been asleep or marshalled by art. It was a moonlit night, and the slaughter of fugitives went on till dawn. Next morning the camp was stormed, and a further massacre took place. Surrender availed nothing. The unhappy prisoners were paraded in long lines, given a little parched grain and a drink of water, and they were all beheaded. Every Afghan tent had heads piled before its doors. The plunder of the camp was prodigious, and the women and children who survived were driven off as slaves. The body of Balaji Rao was brought to the Shah, and everyone gazed in admiration at the beauty of the lad, who seemed only to be sleeping. The Duranis cried out, "This is the body of the king of the unbelievers. We will have it dried and stuffed to carry it back to Kabul." But Shuja-ud-Dawla, who did all he could to help the vanquished army, arranged to have him cremated according to the Hindu rites. He was, however, unable to protect Yangochi Scindia or Ibrahim Khan Gadi, who were both taken prisoners and sacrificed to the conqueror's rage. Ibrahim Khan was a renegade who had fought on the side of the infidels against the true believers. Yangochi was hated by the Rohilas. The Bhao Sahib, when he saw that all was lost, had mounted his charger, and collecting a few men, galloped off into the thick of battle to find a soldier's death. When last seen, he was surrounded by Afghans and fighting desperately. A headless corpse, identified as his, was recovered and cremated, along with that of his nephew. Meanwhile, the peshwa had been planning an expedition to northern India to extricate the Bhao Sahib, and he had, without success, endeavored to enlist the cooperation of the Nizam. Balaji was now in failing health and incapable of acting with promptness. He was distracted by family dissensions and haunted by the spectre of bankruptcy, the result of his far-flung ambitions in the north. But in any case, the Bhao and his heroic comrades were now beyond the reach of earthly help. On 24 January, at Bilsar, a banker's letter was intercepted, which announced in enigmatic language the tragedy that had occurred 10 years previously. 2 pearls have been dissolved, it said. 27 gold mohurs have been lost, and of the silver and copper the total cannot be cast up. Balaji pressed on, hoping that some of his family might have survived, but fugitives now began to come in, who confirmed the completeness of the tragedy. Balaji slowly fell back on Pune, which he reached in June. Here, on the 23rd, he passed away in the palace which he had erected on the Parvati hill, calling for his elder son. It is easy to be wise after the event, and innumerable criticisms have been passed upon the Bhao for his arrogance and his refusal to take advice from his captains. But Balaji Rao, with all his faults, atoned by death for any error of which he must be adjudged guilty. Defeat is sometimes as honorable as victory, and at Panipat the Marathas went down fighting. Holkar and Damaji Gaikwad withdrew when they saw that all was lost. But there does not appear to be sufficient reason for accusing the former of deliberate treachery. According to his own account, the Bhao Sahib had sent him a message telling him to do as he had directed, perhaps to rescue the women and children in the camp, who had been committed to his charge, and to escort them to Delhi. In this he was successful. Naro Shankar and part of the Delhi garrison managed to get away. Maharaji Scindia and Nana Fatnavis were among the few fugitives who escaped almost miraculously from the field. The former received a wound in the leg from a gigantic Afghan though, which lamed him for the rest of his life. About 100,000 Marathas must have perished, and only 1/4 of the fighting men ever saw the Deccan again. Many fugitives were murdered by the peasants, who were only too eager to thus turn the tables upon their former oppressors. Those who straggled into Deeg were, however, hospitably entertained by Suraj Mal, and in this way about 4,000 men reached home. Shamshur Bahadur and Amtaji Mankeshwar died of wounds at Deeg. Never was a defeat more complete, says Elphinstone, and never was there a calamity that diffused so much consternation. Grief and despondency spread over the whole Maratha people. Most had to mourn relatives, and all felt the destruction of the army as a death blow to their national greatness. Most disastrous of all, perhaps, was the fact that it dealt a fatal blow to the one unifying influence in the Deccan, the prestige of the peshwas. It is, of course, true that the Marathas, with characteristic resiliency, recovered from what would have been a crushing disaster to a less hardy nation. In August 1763, they won a brilliant victory over the Nizam at Rakshas Bhavan, but their armies were never again the same. Arab and Hindustani mercenaries, to an increasing degree, replaced the free Maratha troopers, and, most important of all, the weakened power of the Peshwa paved the way to English interference in Maratha affairs. But to Ahmad Shah Abdali also, the victory was a Pyrrhic one. On 22 March, after ransacking Delhi, he withdrew his army. His men, who hated the Indian hot weather, were on the verge of mutiny and insisted on returning home to Afghanistan with their plunder. Ahmad Shah, accordingly, after having left Najib Khan as regent of Delhi, retreated beyond the passes. The poet Mir described Delhi after Abdali's departure. Quote, Delhi in those days was little better than a wilderness, which after 6 months was laying desolate. He had himself experienced the plunder by the Afghans in January. In July came the Maratha occupation, and in January 1761, after the crushing defeat of the Marathas at Panipat, the Afghans again moved in to loot whatever was left to be looted. Mir saw the effects when he visited Delhi a little later. Quote, the scene of desolation filled my eyes with tears and my mind with the most solemn thoughts. At every step my distress and agitation increased. I could not recognize the houses and often lost my bearings. Of the former inhabitants there was no trace, and no matter whom I inquired about, I was told that he was not there, and nobody knew where he might be found. The houses were in ruins, walls had collapsed. Cloisters and wine shops alike were deserted. Whole bazaars had vanished. The children playing in the streets, the comely young men, the austere elders, all had gone. Whole quarters were in ruins, their lanes desolate. Everywhere was a terrible emptiness. All at once I found myself in the quarter where I had once lived. I recalled the life I used to live there. foregathering with my friends in the evening, reciting poetry, and living the life of a lover, weeping at night for the love of beautiful women, writing verses to them, and passing my days in the company of those whose long tresses held me there captive, and knowing no peace when I could not be with them. In those days I had really lived. And what was there now? Not a soul whom I ever recognized, and with whom I could hope to pass a pleasant few moments in conversation. I came away from the lane, and stood on the deserted road, gazing in stunned silence at the scene of desolation, and filled with abhorrence at what I saw. And there and then I made a vow that as long as I lived, I would never come to Delhi again. End quote.